rained through her fingers. Page 1 to 10. Elaine sat by the window, muffled in shawls and reading a Mrs. Radcliffe novel from a set she'd rescued months ago. The cover was stained, the pages wrinkled, and in some places, smeared by running ink. However, it was the first warmish day of spring, and thin sunshine struggled through the grey-touched clouds. Elaine was determined to enjoy it. What a lovely day it turned out to be, Tom! She exclaimed rapturously to the marmalade-coloured cat washing himself on the sill. Tom was a frequent visitor, indeed her only one. His appearance brightened her whole day. I do believe, Elaine went on, that we will have a warm spring. This prediction was immediately belied by a gust of wind, reeking of salt and sewage, edged with cold. It riffled the pages of The Romance of the Forest, and pulled strands of her brown hair into Elaine's face. Elaine shivered and sank deeper into the musty recesses of the armchair. Outside the house on Marine Parade, the shifting grey-green sea caught the sunshine, splintering it into myriad gleams. Foam-capped wavelets rolled into Brighton, slurping against plaster and brick. Behind them, an almost normal sea stretched back to a distant, unbroken horizon. Wait, maybe not unbroken after all. Elaine narrowed her eyes at the faraway smudge, holding up a hand to shade her face. The book fell onto her lap, ignored. Her heart gave one unwanted leap. A ship. The next moment, frown lines bit deep between Elaine's eyebrows. Her mouth went twisted and grim. Far out at sea, the air wavered, like a flutter of diaphanous drapes. It was so slight a movement that Elaine would have missed it if she hadn't been looking for it. Abruptly, Elaine shoved the book onto a rickety end table and got to her feet, heedless of the slanted ceiling a hand's breadth above her head. She scooped Tom from his perch. "It's rather cold after all," she announced to her domain of broken furniture and salvaged supplies, "and it's time we had afternoon tea." Tom wriggled free of her hold, landed on the wooden boards with a soft thump, and jumped up onto a nearby stool. Elaine struggled with the stiff sash window. The wind was picking up, and the sea had darkened in response, and shut it with a bang. She squeezed past her makeshift water butt, and over to kneel beside the hob grate in the chimney. Elaine struggled longer than usual with flint and steel. Her stomach was clenched into a tight knot. If only they would stop provoking him. With shaking hands, she coaxed the coals alight. Smoke rose up the chimney. With a whisper, Elaine twined a "don't notice me" charm into it. She was good at those enchantments, having learned them at her mother's knee. A small magic fit for a mouse, he had once sneered. Elaine took 3 deep breaths, then poured water into a kettle and put it on. The familiar movements of routine calmed her pounding heart. While the water boiled, Elaine laid the nearby table, a writing desk with elegant lyre-shaped legs. For tea, she placed a silver teapot, and a chipped gold-rimmed cup, with pink roses on a silver tray. Then she added her small, precious store of sugar in a sauce jar and a mismatched blue plate. On a day that had suddenly become so trying, she decided she would eat another biscuit. There were only 3 left in the box. Well, she had made them last so long, and they were getting rather stale. Elaine put one, a pale circle with a raised edge and 3 stamped feathers, on the plate. Even the tea was running low. Despite all her straining and reusing, only a thin dusting of leaves covered the bottom of the caddy. Elaine scooped up a small spoonful and placed it into the pot. The kettle hissed steam. She took it off and poured the hot water in one scalding stream. At least there was plenty of clean water. Elaine moved the armchair over and seated herself, closing her eyes to better enjoy the scent of steeping tea. Even before the first sip, it soothed her nerves, for her nerves did indeed need soothing. To her annoyance, a part of her mind was still straining towards the world outside. The frothing sea, the flickering barrier, the ship on the horizon. to that feeling of heaviness in the air, the greasiness against her skin, the gathering. Enough. Elaine opened her eyes. Her hands on the table had curled themselves into fists, forcing them to relax. Elaine looked at her hands as if they belonged to a stranger. Slender-fingered hands, once soft and white, now chapped and roughened from unwonted work. There was a nick on one of her fingers. She wondered idly if it had happened when she'd been leaning half out of the window yesterday, wrestling with the pipes. With a shadow leap of movement, Tom jumped onto the table. He didn't meow. He wasn't much for talking, but he nudged Elaine's shoulder in a hard, caressing sort of way. I know. Elaine scratched behind his ears, then rose to fetch a hat box. It was too fancy for its contents, but Elaine didn't have many choices. It could have been worse, though, if Mrs. Babcock hadn't sent out of fashion furnishings up to the attic at regular intervals. Strips of dried sole, the product of one memorable experiment earlier in the year, nestled inside several layers of paper lining. It had seemed a good idea, but by the time Elaine was done with the salty, smoky process, she had lost her appetite for fish. Tom hadn't, though, and he accepted a piece with regal appreciation, his purr a friendly rumble in the silence. While her feline companion made short work of the fish, Elaine sipped tea and nibbled at the biscuit. If she ate slowly, perhaps she could fool her stomach into believing it received more nourishment than it did. At any rate, Elaine said aloud, maybe there will be provisions after tonight. She immediately felt guilty for even thinking it, but it had been a long while since the water rose to cover the second-floor windows and barrels and crates knocked against the windows of the third. If she was to continue her quiet existence in the attic on Marine Parade, she needed supplies. Supper was salted pork and beans, heated over the fire. Elaine cleaned up afterwards, putting all the dishes in a tin hip bath, and washing them with a sliver of soap and a reckless amount of water. Why? She could even bathe tonight, scrub herself with the Windsor soap poor Lydia had never had the chance to use, unpin her hair and rinse it clean. The upcoming storm would bring her plenty more rain. She felt it in the air already. Only a little coaxing would direct it to refill the half-empty water butt. Later that evening, Elaine made her way to her bedchamber, partitioned from the rest of the space by a floor-to-ceiling stack of boxes, crates, and odds and ends. A heavy early dusk had fallen over Brighton, and her oil lantern was a tiny gold flicker in the gloom. The dishes were laid to dry on a bench, the hip bath emptied and overturned on the bare boards. Her skin was cold but clean under a robe. Masses of damp hair fell down her back. If only heat was as abundant as water. Elaine wrapped her hair in a towel, then wrapped herself in another shawl. Outside, the wind gusted against the houses, ran whistling through a break in Marine Parade. Elaine wasn't sure which of the houses had not survived the deluge, but the moaning wind marked their absence on countless nights. If she strained, she could hear the lap and lick of waves against the walls. It was beginning. Elaine hesitated, and then, before she could think better of it, swooped up the lantern and opened the attic door. The hinges, not much used, creaked. Elaine took one step across the threshold, stood listening. The narrow hallway was even darker. Next to her was the second attic room, where the Babcock's maids had once slept. It was empty now. Elaine had stolen into it only once since the night of the Babcock's ball. Even though the room's occupants were never coming back, she'd felt all wrong rummaging through their meager possessions. She hadn't felt that way salvaging in the rooms below. A wind throbbed through the house, blowing through broken windows. A chill draft whisked around Elaine's bare feet, rustling the hem of her robe. The small flame in her lantern twisted and stretched into a thin, pale thread. Shadows skittered across the walls and ceiling. Elaine listened. In the opposite corner of the attic, At the other end of the hallway was a dark square set in the floor, the stairs leading down. A faint chuckle emanated from the stairwell, the small sinister sound of water nibbling at wood and plaster. Gnawing and gnawing, it exhaled an odor of rotten mildew. Elaine's nostrils flared, but the stench was bearable. It hadn't been, in the early days. A slam made Elaine jump, her shadow racing across the ceiling. But the sound had come from outside, perhaps a lone shutter banging against the house or a door, finally giving way under the sea's onslaught. The house shivered in the rising wind. There was nothing to be done out here. Elaine slipped back into safety and bolted the door shut. That night, Elaine lay in her old iron bedstead, her face turned towards the window above. Dark clouds spread across the sky, rain lashed against the glass. The world outside was a dark blur. The wind raised its voice in a howl, and the house shuddered in response. Nameless things rattled and banged out in the darkness. Elaine only half heard. Most of her was wrapped around the ropes of rain slithering from the sky, striking the roof, sliding down the walls. It was blind and loud and angry, a destructive rain. She spoke to it softly, so softly, deflected its temper elsewhere. Dimly, she was aware of the churning sea throwing itself against Brighton. Dark and deep, its power and fury were far too great for her. The tempest raged on, and still Elaine gentled and soothed, teased away fragments of its power for her own small enchantments. With some she refilled her water butt, channeling the rain through a pipe that led from the gutter, into the ceiling, and down to the barrel. Other charms she sent to one place in Brighton, where they soaked along with the rain into tile and stucco, wooden plaster and fabric. There they'd wait, incomplete, just in case she ever had to use them. This time, she was taking no chances. There was no mercy in him. Finally, the relentless drumming gave way to a gentle patter. The clouds spent themselves and the world lightened. The tantrum of the tempest gave way to a sad sighing of wind. Elaine thought she could hear sobbing in it. There was a deep ache in her muscles, her bones, her soul, not like the crippling agony that had gripped her in the aftermath of the deluge, but enough to warn her. Pushing herself in unwonted ways came with a price. Elaine slipped her hand under the pillow. Warm glass met her seeking fingers. The power within it stirred, disturbed by the unnatural storm. But it was still there, still safe. Tiredness weighed Elaine's eyelids. She let out a sudden, cracking, an unladylike yawn. She didn't even notice the slight shift in weight as Tom moved position, but his rough warmth and rumbling purr were next to her ear. She slept. Elaine snapped awake. It was still dark, though finally clear. The sea had subsided to a murmur. The wind dropped to a breeze. Moonlight flooded through the window, shining on her face. But that hadn't woken her. A scrape in the darkness, the bump of window against sill, the stealthy step of a foot, shivering through the floorboards.